Hooker says very clearly that, like I said, there is no natural government. There's natural society. And if there's no natural government, what that means is that the original condition is one of equality, not of subjection. And therefore, to explain why some are subjected to others, we need consent.
Hello, and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Alexander Rosenthal-Pubul. He is a lecturer at Johns Hopkins Government Program, and we are here today to talk about his book, Crown Under Law, Richard Hooker, John Locke, and the Ascent of Modern Constitutionalism. Dr. Rosenthal-Pubul, wonderful to have you today.
Thanks. Glad to be back. I was here once before on the wisdom of our ancestors, but I'm glad to be back to discuss this work.
Well, I really enjoyed that episode, and I've had Dr. McLear on a couple of times since. It's always a joy. I'm glad to have you back on. So just to start off with that initial question, why this book? Why do we need to know about Richard Hooker?
Yeah, so I think John Locke, who's part of the book, needs no introduction. If there's a single figure who is responsible for the American political creed that you find in the Declaration of Independence, it would be John Locke. But Richard Hooker is a much more obscure figure, and that's I thought was a curious thing, because there are 16 references to Hooker. He's basically Locke's go-to in the second treatise of government, Locke's most important political work. And so part of it is the enigma. Why this is a figure you can look at much more carefully. But I think most of all, he is a bridge figure between the medieval and the modern world, who tells us a lot about how constitutionalism developed. And I think by looking at Hooker, we find a different story about how this idea of constitutionalism came into being. And of course, that's sort of the central theme in my book. If you want, I can just briefly sketch what I think constitutionalism is.
That was the next question. So you anticipated me. I love it.
Okay, great. So I think of constitutionalism, the way I defined it in the book is a synthesis of answers to three core questions in political philosophy. So first is, what is the relationship of law and power? And the answer that constitutionalism gives is that power should be placed under law. So it's anti-absolutist, right? As Hooker said, happier that people whose law is their king in the greatest things than that whose king is himself the law, right? The second is a theory of sovereignty, right? Where does sovereignty arise? And in the early modern period, you had the divine right of kings emerging, actually. People think it's a medieval idea. It's really an early modern idea. So that's part of the corrective I think I'd like to offer. But what constitutionalism argues is that sovereignty is vested in the whole community, right? And is delegated to a king or to a democratic system or whatever type of whoever holds authority in the society. And the third is, what is the basis of political obligation? Why should we obey? Which I think is something everybody kind of thinks about. Why do we obey laws? What gives them legitimacy? And what constitutionalism answers is that what gives government's legitimacy is the consent of those who are governed. And this we find very clearly in Richard Hooker. All three ideas, in fact. So that's how I would define constitutionalism in brief. So a theory of law, placing power under law, a theory of sovereignty, vesting it in the whole community, and a theory of political obligation, basing obligation on consent.
And when we talk about where is sovereignty located, we of course mentioned the divine right of kings. That's something that's coming out of like Louis XIV, which is, this early modern kind of idea. When we talk about the whole community, I feel like there's another side to this. One of the you talk about Strauss's interpretation a lot of Locke, and you talk about how Strauss stresses. That feels like not the best phrase, or maybe it's a really good phrase. Strauss stresses. No, he talks about Hobbes' influence on Locke, and you talk about Hooker's influence on Locke. How does because of course Hobbes has the social contract. How does Hooker and Hobbes differ? Because they're writing at a similar time, correct?
Well, Hobbes would be a little bit later. So Hobbes is born, if I remember, 1588, which is easy to remember because of the Spanish Armada.
Yes.
And Hooker is purely Elizabethan. So he's born in 1554 and dies in 1600. Hobbes had a very long life. But in terms of how they differ, so let me just address the Straussian thing. So one of the things that my research, I went into Locke's own notes when I went into Oxford, and there's almost no reference to Hobbes, as there's almost very little reference to Hobbes in I think Locke calls him at one point the justly decried name, but there's very little reference. But I did find a lot of reference. I think he calls him the justly decried name, but he calls Hooker the judicious Hooker. And Strauss kind of portrays Locke as sort of a closet Hobbesian in certain ways. But I think the historical record shows that Hooker was actually the much more prominent influence on Locke. I mean, Hooker is quoted 16 times. So what are the basic differences? So I would say so there's a concept, they both talk about compact or contracts, right? The social contract theory. But there's different kinds of contract theory in the early modern period. Hobbes is called a pactum societatis. So he portrays humanity as being, man as being originally just individuals, right? And then the contract actually remember the war of each against all, and then the contract actually creates the society. Hooker is much more in the classical and medieval tradition of saying that humans are naturally social, right? Just like Aristotle says, humans have language. We don't survive as just individual beings, unlike solitary animals, right? So societies are natural. But what he does is, what Hooker does, and this is I think the very vital, crucial move, he distinguishes between society and politics, right? So the question is, okay, humans are naturally social, but is there a natural political form, right? And so, no, the answer is no. We find monarchies, aristocracies, democracies, all kinds of forms in history. So how do we decide which one? Well, the society decides, right? So there's a pact that creates the government or decides what form of government is going to exist. The second way I would say that Hooker differs markedly from Hobbes is that Hobbes actually says at one point that before there was law, there was no injustice, right? That, in other words, before the social contract comes into being, we're in a pre-moral universe in some sense. Whereas Hooker is very much in a Thomistic tradition of believing in natural law, so that even in this society, and Locke makes the same argument, even in this society before politics, the state, which Locke would famously call the state of nature, right? Even in that state, human beings would be fundamentally under a moral law. So the state of nature, we could say there's a state of nature in Hobbes, a state of nature in Hooker. But for Hooker, it's not pre-social and it's not pre-moral. And for Hobbes, it is, if I were to summarize.
Yeah, I'm actually a little frustrated because what I should have done is I should have had you on to interview about this before we did Wisdom of the Ancients and before I had Dr. McLear on for his last book, because those two books make so much more sense now as you're talking about this. Like when you talk about the need to divide into different institutions and not give everything over to the state. I mean, yes. A lot of this is coming out of the Hobbes versus Hooker distinction, because for Hobbes, the state is basically everything, whereas Hooker has places and uses for different institutions. Is that a right reading of that?
Yeah, yes. So I think, so here's a fundamental misconception that I hope my book did something to challenge, at least. There's a conception that there was divine, like the Middle Ages was about divine right of kings and absolutism, And then in the Enlightenment, somehow in the 18th century or something like that, this idea of liberty emerged and overthrew these clerical chains and created modern liberal constitutional states. So that view is quite wrong. So, I mean, if you look at the medieval period, St. Thomas Aquinas, who's a big source for Hooker, St. Thomas Aquinas argues that you are not required to obey laws which go against the natural law, that those kinds of laws that go against the natural or the divine law are actually acts of force or violence by the king, right? Or by the public authority, right? And this was quoted by Martin Luther King, for example. The right to resist, Thomas Aquinas was quoted by on this point. And he says that there are cases where, when he deals with the question of sedition, where the one guilty of sedition is the ruler, not the people, that they can remove a tyrannical ruler. So this was the medieval view. And in practical terms, kings had much less authority in the Middle Ages because of feudalism and so forth. What was happening in the modern period, and here we're talking about 16th and 17th centuries, is that kings are in France, in Spain, in England, they are bringing the feudal lords to heel, creating professionalized armies, modern administrative states, and you need a new theory to justify this, right? And so you have people like Baudin going back to Roman law with this idea of princeps legibus solutus, that the king is absolved of the law, the king and the source of the law, right?
Yeah.
So this is an absolutist theory. And then you have the patriarchalists, who we could talk about later. But you have theories, Hobbes is another example, all the way on the other, even though he's a contractarian, but he ends in with an absolutist theory. So you have political theories emerging to justify this new absolutism, and one of them is the divine right of kings. So in fact, what we call constitutionalism is drawing on an older tradition resisting the modern development. It's an irony, but that's more or less what's happening.
Well, and I think there's something interesting here when you talk about in the medieval period. One of the things that struck me, I've been reading more history in that time period, and they didn't completely conflate the church and the state, but there was a much closer relationship. And one of the ways that showed up is that they started talking about, in the way that in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about the church as a body. And that's always been, it's like, oh, we have different members doing different things. It's okay to be, it's important that we're different, right? Yes. The same thing gets applied to the medieval state. And so there is a kind of dignity. There isn't just the king overall. There's a hierarchy, and it's supposed to, in the same way that the human body and the human mind and the human soul reflects the cosmos at large, the state is supposed to do that as well. And so there's a certain amount of dignity and I won't say use, but purpose for each member of society that gives them leverage. Is that a which I think Hooker picks up on, but Locke, maybe I'm jumping too far there, but it seems like Locke doesn't pick up on that as much.
Well, yeah, I think that's right about the Middle Ages. So there's a concept. So on the one hand, Christianity brings this idea of equality of dignity. You see it in Galatians, right? There's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. But on the other hand, as you're pointing out in Corinthians, there's also a sense that there are different functions and gifts and vocations within the society. And this is a strongly part of the medieval worldview. So you have the churchmen, which exist in a kind of hierarchy, and then you have the different orders of nobility and so forth. But what's important about the Middle Ages is that the modern state had not yet developed. In fact, the Roman state had collapsed, remember, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, and the church, in some sense, began to fill the vacuum. And that's why the church played such a prominent specifically political role. And you had this idea of Christendom, right? So people in the Middle Ages, I think, would identify much less as being Spanish, English, French, Italian, and much more as part of this body of Christendom, right? The body of Christians, in some sense, under the spiritual rule of the Pope and the, in theory, temporal rule of the Holy Roman Emperor. So it was considered like one community with a spiritual and a temporal function. But what's happening in modernity is discovering this idea of sovereignty, right? So you're having the emergence as kings get stronger relative to the church and relative to the feudal lords, they're creating these sovereign states, which is what we start to think of as Spain, England, France, in much more robust sense. Those offices like King of France existed, but in practice they had relatively little power. So I think that's the political dynamic we need to understand as we're shifting into the modern era.
Not to get too deep in the weeds, but this has been helpful for me because it's very confusing, because it's like, was the Holy Roman Emperor in charge of everybody? And the answer is yes, but not in the way that we think of being in charge, right? To use a really kind of colloquial example, we have a long staircase in our house, and sometimes I'll yell up for my kids, and sometimes they can't hear me, right? And it's like, right? And sometimes I have to go all the way upstairs, and I'm like, you heard me, right? And what we see is, and I think it's part of the reason this happens, we get the modern state, and that you have to put all these pieces together to understand what's going on, is the Holy Roman Emperor was in charge, but communication and speed of travel and all these things were so much lower that for the most part, you either did not hear from the Holy Roman Emperor and you just kind of lived your own life, or you could judiciously ignore him. And then but you had to be careful how far you pushed it, because then sometimes he showed up at your door with an army, right?
Yeah. Well, the other thing you have to remember, right? So, I mean, symbolically, it all goes back to the Constantine and the old Roman emperor. And of course, Charlemagne is crowned as sort of the new Western Roman emperor, much to the chagrin of the Byzantines. But Charlemagne is crowned as sort of the new Roman emperor. So you have this idea of the temporal king and the spiritual ruler, the Pope, and who was really in charge of Christendom was the constantly contested issue in the Middle Ages. But what you have to remember in the practical terms that you're talking about is feudalism, right? Because in practical terms, any king or emperor had to rely on the feudal lords to supply his armies. And those feudal lords had their own lands, their own armies, and so forth. So in practical terms, I would say much less actual authority than the Roman emperors of old, or even the Byzantine emperors. But symbolically, the idea of the Holy Roman Emperor had tremendous importance, right? So,
right, you couldn't say he didn't have any.
Smith talks about the Holy Roman Emperor as the katakon, from Thessalonians, the one who's restraining the coming of Antichrist and all this sort of thing. So, symbolically very important. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's not that. Yeah. Definitely not the same as the Roman Emperor. And you can't say he doesn't have any authority. It's so. I keep reading it and I'm like. And it keeps shifting with each different Holy Roman Emperor. And then sometimes the Pope's in charge. And then sometimes he's living in Avignon and being told what to do by the King of France. And I'm like, I can't keep it straight, right? There's so many little bits and pieces.
There's a constant seesaw battle for and of course, Pope Gregory VII excommunicated, famously the Holy Roman Emperor had to come to Canossa to beg the Pope for forgiveness. Because of course, the Pope didn't have the military power, but if the Pope in the Middle Ages says you can't have sacraments, you can't have marriages, you can't have confession, then people start to feel like their souls are imperiled. And he absolved the feudal lords of their oaths. So the church had ways to find leverage. Famously in the 19th century, Bismarck said we're not, had his own conflict with the papacy. And he said, I'm not going to Canossa, referring back to the 11th century. Yes. So.
Yeah. And I mean, and I love that you do a great job at the end of your book drawing out, right? You even mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., referencing Aquinas. It's very clear this stuff is still relevant. But I apologize. I'm going a little far afield, but I think it's useful even talking about this leading into Hooker's context. So to understand Richard Hooker, you need to really understand Elizabethan England. Do you mind giving us a little bit of understanding why he writes the laws?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, Tudor England is a fascinating period, and is a constant subject of it's referred to in Shakespeare all the time, who of course lived in the Elizabethan era. So, I mean, it's a fascinating period, and I would say particularly for the religious convulsions of the
Yeah.
time. So just imagine that you were born in the time of Henry. So you would have been born, and in those days, the idea was cuius regio ilius religio, that you were supposed to follow the religion of the ruler. So imagine you're born a Catholic in the reign of Henry VIII, who then breaks from the church and declares himself king. So now you can't be a Catholic legally. They were martyrs, but you couldn't legally be a Catholic. And then it became sort of more Protestant under Edward, right? And started to get influences from the Continental Reformation. And then you get Mary, who reconciles the church to his daughter, right? Who from Catherine of Aragon, who reconciles the church to the Pope, and now prohibits Protestantism, right? Whereas before Catholicism was prohibited, now Protestantism is prohibited, and there were Protestant martyrs under her reign. So now you're a Catholic again. And then she was married to Philip II of Spain, who was not able to produce a Catholic heir for her. So when she died, and Elizabeth comes in 1556, if I recall. So now the question is, so what's going to happen now to religion, right? What are we going to do with religion, right? And so she creates a kind of, she creates in some sense Anglicanism as we begin to know it today, which is meant as kind of a via media. So it keeps Catholic elements like bishops and many of the ritual elements like the use of vestments, Catholic, and priesthood and all these kinds of things, but severs again from the Catholic Church, declares the act of supremacy. The monarch is the ruler over the church, and so forth. Now, this satisfies actually neither side, right? Because the Catholics obviously want England to go back to Roman Catholicism. Now, but what you had during Mary's reign was a lot of Protestants going to the continent and becoming influenced by Calvinism, particularly, right? Which is probably the most international from Geneva. Calvin was sometimes called like the Protestant Pope. He exercised like this tremendous pan-European influence. And so what you start to get are Protestants who say that this Anglicanism of Elizabeth is fundamentally Catholic and idolatrous, right? They don't like the vestments. They don't like the episcopacy. And they basically say the law, the rule of life should be based upon the Bible as they understand it. And what they say is that we need to purify the Church of England from all Catholic remnants, ergo Puritanism, right? And so one of their basic ideas, a lot of them are thinking in terms of something. Well, we had this in the United States, right? In Massachusetts, sort of theocratic, biblical-based societies, and that the laws should all be based on the Bible. Whereas the Anglicans were saying that there are things indifferent, right? Things where Scripture is silent on, and on those things, the Parliament and the bishop, the bishops and so forth, get to decide, right? So that was basically the dispute as it was going on. Now, while this is all going on, you have tremendous political conflicts, right? Because Elizabeth, of course, suppresses the Act of Uniformity, requires everybody to attend Church of England services. So both the Catholics and the Puritans are increasingly repressed. This is one of the factors that eventually leads to the early American colonies. And to top it off, the Pope has excommunicated Elizabeth and called for the Catholic princes to remove her from the throne. which eventually leads to a war with Spain. So England feels under threat both within. Elizabethan England feels under threat both within and from without. So I would say Richard Hooker is the most prominent figure of this period who is developing a defense of the Elizabethan settlement in his 8 books of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. So it's the most copious and influential defense of we could say the Anglican settlement of Elizabeth, but it also includes, particularly in the 8th book, a lot of political reflections, and that's where Locke and others were able to draw on his authority, and he becomes really an authority. Throughout the 18th century, the 17th century, he's quoted by every side in political controversies and in religious questions as well.
And I should have written this down, but I think it's 1590s that the laws are coming out, right?
1593, if I remember.
And I think there's multiple editions, as there often were, right? So I think it's, anyways. And forgive me, I had a teacher who was really big on this when he talked to, you're talking about this this interpretation from Scripture, that Scripture should give us the answer for our government.
Yes.
Part of the reason, as I understand it, that Hooker was so influential was that the Anglican answer had been the same, that it was supposed to be from Scripture that we got our government. And both sides were just going back and forth proof texting. And then if I understand, and maybe this could help lead us into some further discussion, that Hooker split natural law from human law, that he puts human law under natural law, but by splitting natural law and divine law from human law, he is able to provide a better defense. And this is why everyone kind of agrees this is better, right? Some of the Puritans still kind of struggle against this because, then of course they can't rebel.
Well, by the way, I think Cromwell and a few years of actual Puritan rule and the stages being cured England permanently, both apparently of republicanism, not having a king, as well as a Puritanism.
That'll do it.
But of course, it became a fact as Puritans were leaving England. Of course, it became a factor in the United States, in the colonial America as well, right? An important factor. So Archbishop Whitgift, his basic argument was that there are things indifferent, right? So a Catholic would say that bishops have a scriptural authority in the apostolic succession, right? That the apostles were the first bishops, effectively, and then priests were appointed and so forth, right? But Archbishop Whitgift was talking about things indifferent, right? So there are aspects of church governance and things like vestments that where human authority can play a role, where the scriptures are not, let's say, decisive or clear, we could say. And the Puritan position was that whatever is not in the scripture is fundamentally idolatrous. So they took a very hard, whatever, right? And whatever comes from the Pope in particular, they said, comes from the Antichrist. And so anything that resembles Catholicism, they had a very strong aversion to. Now, so all Hooker was doing actually in the first book, it's largely, I would say, a restatement of Thomism with some adaptations. But so for Thomas, there's an order of laws. So you have the eternal law, which is the divine wisdom, which is the source of all law. And then you have the natural law, right, which is the law of our natures leading us toward the good. So you don't actually need, and this has a scriptural root in Romans 2, I believe, right? When Gentiles who have not the law do by nature what the law requires, they show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, and their conscience also bears witness. So this idea of a law written on our hearts is the natural law, what you could discover as good or evil. If you're seeing somebody, torturing a child, you don't need to open up your Bible to know that that's wrong, what's going on. So that's kind
Hopefully.
of the natural law in a nutshell.
Yeah.
But of course, it's worked out in all its precepts and how do we know and so forth, right? So it's a law of reason as well, right? So human reason can discern from nature what's good and evil. There's also the divine law of Scripture, we should say, maybe above the natural law. We could say and then there is positive law, which would be the law of the state, right? So in England's case, we're talking about the laws of Parliament and the common law, right? And so the idea is the ultimate source is the eternal law, right? The human laws are meant to apply the precepts of divine and natural law, right? For example, how do we punish theft? Theft is against theft or murder or whatever is against natural law, but how do we go about punishing it? Well, that's what we have Parliament for. They're going to set the penalties. And so there's the structure of law, which is very medieval. This is not an innovation at all. This is very medieval. It goes all, and Hooker is in this respect very much a Thomist, and including on his idea that God decrees the good because it is good. Right, because it's rational, because it's consonant with the divine goodness and the divine wisdom, as against a voluntarist position, which would be more what some Calvinists were arguing, that, for example, there was a debate over predestination. Does God condemn you to hell because God decided by a fiat of his will, or because it's in accord with the divine justice? So he was very much a Thomist on all of this. Now, what its political implication is that both the state is limited both from above by divine and by natural law, but it's limited also from below by the laws which come from Parliament and from the common law. So the king is essentially bound, well, as the title says, under the law. Both under the divine and natural law, and from below by the people, by the law of the Commonwealth, right? The law of Parliament.
Which you did a great job explaining that earlier, right? Like when it comes to the question of law and power is under law, which if for the divine right of kings, the power and the law are either fused together or just like the law descends from the king. Is that?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. So, I mean, like I said, Baudin was appealing to Roman law principles that the king is the source of the law, right? And as the source of the law, the superior commanding, he can't be under his own will.
Yeah. Right.
And I think I should probably mention something about patriarchalism at this point, because it's such a big theme. And it's specifically what Locke was reacting to. So one of the theories to justify this new concept of absolutism is this idea of patriarchalism. And so patriarchalism argues that the power of the king is fundamentally like the power of the father. So you are born in a family from the 16th and 17th century view under subjection to the authority of the father. Pater potestas in the Roman understanding, right? And so what patriarchalism rests on is this idea of the identification of paternal rule with royal rule. Right. So in Sir Robert Filmer's treatise, right, and now we're looking at 17th century, and this is going to be the treatise that was published posthumously that Locke objects to. So he argues that Adam was both the father of the human race, right, and the king of the human race. And that every human generation is born in a condition of subjection, right, to a king, right, to the lawful authority, and that there's basically a lineage going from Adam to the kings of their time, and this is patriarchalism, right? So, and that this is by divine fiat, right? That Adam is given dominion by God, right, and is given dominion basically over his children. And therefore there is someone appointed, we could say. And this is something Hooker, and patriarchalism already existed in Hooker's time, There were people like Hadrian Saravia, who I referenced, right, in the 1500s. Hooker says very clearly that, like I said, there is no natural government. There's natural society. And if there's no natural government, what that means is that the original condition is one of equality, not of subjection. And therefore, to explain why some are subjected to others, we need consent. And so I think that's the crucial move.
Can you say that one more time? Because I do feel, that definitely feels crucial.
Yeah. So what Hooker says is that we are not born in a condition of subjection, right? Like the patriarchalist says. So how do we explain why some rule over others? Well, so our original condition is in some sense one of equality and liberty, right, within the natural law. And so to explain why we come under government, we need consent, the assent of those who are governed, right? Which explains why some rule over others. And that's what legitimates rule, is this mechanism of consent.
How does he argue against subjection, that we're born into subjection like that?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, if you look at the variety of commonwealths and so forth, right? And also he says that, so Aristotle has an idea that politics is natural, right? And that the wise have some kind of natural authority over the foolish, we could say, in some sense, right? But Aristotle argues, but he doesn't distinguish society from politics. But Hooker basically says that for anyone to assert that claim would be problematic, right? I have the right to rule you, right? And so the orderly way, right? So if there's a pre-political condition, right, as is implied by the fact that we need to choose some form of government, and there's a wide variety of forms of government. If there's a pre-political condition, that society has a right to choose for itself who governs, right? And that's the only stable way that you're going to have government, because if someone simply asserts, I have the right to govern you, you're going to have all kinds of problems. So, yeah.
I mean, that's a great answer. And it explains, too, why that, I mean, it was all kind of obvious from the beginning that move was really important. But that move in distinguishing society from the state is so kind of essential.
Yes. I mean, so here is what Hooker says. He says, to fathers within their private family's nature have given a supreme power, howbeit over a grand multitude, having no such dependency upon anyone, impossible it is that anyone should have complete lawful power but by consent of men. Right. So that's another, I should have mentioned, another important argument that he brings up. The child is not intellectually developed enough to govern themselves. But if we're talking about adults ruling over adults, how do you establish that you have just by fiat a right to rule somebody else? So it says that he says that it's lawful when he's, quote, granted or consented by them over whom they exercise the same. So that's So that's the nuts and bolts of it.
You've been incredibly patient. Thank you for walking me through this. So I think now's the time where we show the modern relevance. And really, I mean, I want to say that Richard Hooker is modern, is relevant, but a lot of it comes through Locke. How does Locke appropriate this understanding? And how does he, I won't say misappropriate, but how does he change it to fit his agenda?
Well, it's a spin. It's definitely a spin. And Strauss was right to that degree. I don't agree with his Hobbesian reading of Locke, but it's true that it's a spin. But this, the spin in some sense, you were compelled to take a side in the 17th century. So Hooker is defending the Elizabethan settlement at a time when there was basically harmony within the English. There was not harmony on the question of religion, as we just looked at, but within monarch, parliament, etc., there was basic harmony between the king and between the queen and parliament. What happens is that totally goes out the window in the 17th century, right? So, King Charles I begins collecting taxes without consulting parliament. This religious conflict between the Anglicans, which the king supported, and the Puritans becomes much more intense in the 17th century. And eventually you have the English Civil War breaking out. I'm just laying about, if you don't mind, I'm just laying out a little bit so we can draw the bridge from Hooker to Locke, right? Because
please,
Hooker
always love historical
context. Basically a conservative purpose, defending the established order, but Locke is not doing that. But let's just look at what's happening. So, so after Cromwell's death and some years of Puritan ruler, they kill the king and so forth, and establish like a Puritan commonwealth. There's a restoration, right? And so these questions are momentarily quieted, but they increase under the Royalists, not least because the religious question again. His Catholic brother James was viewed as problematic by the Protestants. So the question again was, who rules, Parliament or the king? Right? Where is sovereignty really vested? Okay, now Hooker by this time is a gigantic figure. I mean, he is sort of the authority for Anglicanism, and both sides are so you have England dividing into two sides. We could say the Royalists, or eventually those who came out of the Cavaliers from the Civil War, the Royalists, and the Roundheads, right? But later in the Restoration period, it would be the Whigs and the Tories, right? So the Tories defending royal authority and the Whigs defending parliamentary supremacy, right? And so now Locke's patron, the Earl of Shaftesbury, is a zealous Whig, right? And so in 1685, King James actually takes power, okay? And so what happens is the Whigs want him out. Locke and the Earl of Shaftesbury temporarily leave England. And in 1688, you have the revolution, the Whig Revolution, right? Which has been known in history as the Glorious Revolution, which is clearly taking the Whig side in this debate.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. And in 1688, you have the Whig Revolution. And this is what Locke is writing his two treatises to defend, right? So he's writing against Filmer and his patriarchal theory that I just laid out, that the king has a divine right, and so resistance to the king is inherently seditious. And so Locke wants to sort of develop, we could say, Hooker's theory into a theory of resistance. Now, there's just one more thing I can point to for why Locke chooses Hooker as his intellectual sort of godfather. So Filmer, these ideas that I laid out about consent and contract and natural law and all these things the case was not only being made by Hooker, it was also being made by Jesuits, by the school of Salamanca in Spain, right? Who didn't like this idea of the kings, changing the religion and subordinating the church and so forth, right? And so they were also defending a form of constitutional Thomism. And these are the people that Filmer was writing against, right? These are the people Filmer is writing against, these Jesuits, right? So he references Suarez, he references Bellarmine, Robert Bellarmine, famous from the Galileo case. And so Locke, clearly as a Protestant Whig, is not going to be using Suarez as his defense, and the Jesuits as his defense. But fortunately for Locke, he has a very devout and established and respected Anglican thinker who made exactly the same arguments, essentially.
Yes.
Right? I mean, essentially the same. So this is why Locke is resorting so much to Hooker, because Filmer's kind of making it sound like constitutionalism is this alien Catholic idea, but Locke is able, by referring to the authority of Hooker, to show continuity with this very established traditional figure.
Yes, and to keep it safely Protestant too, because he doesn't want to get excoriated by his own side.
Right. In fact, the Whigs were, in a sense, more anti-Protestant because they wanted to remove King James II, who was the Catholic king. So he would not have. It wouldn't have made sense for him to refer to Suarez, but by a historical happenstance. So the trick for Locke is, how do you turn Hooker's theory into a theory of resistance against the monarchy?
Right, which Hooker would not have appreciated. Like, Hooker was defending a very conservative idea.
Very much so, yeah. Right.
So how does he do it? Yeah.
Right. So if you think about the logic of what, so Hooker seems to assume that the monarch is not going to go against Parliament, not going to go against natural law, not going to go against any of these things, right? Now, so the big question becomes, well, if consent is the basis of political obligation, right? So then if you have a tyrannical monarch, right, or one you perceive as tyrannical, then does the Commonwealth, does the community have the right to remove that monarch if sovereignty is ultimately vested in the community, and if their consent is the ultimate basis of political obligation, right? And so what Locke basically argues is, using Hooker, so he says you have this state of nature, which is a state of equality and liberty, right? Sovereignty is vested in the community, as Hooker said. They've given authority over to the king for the protection of their rights. And I think Locke's rights theory is more elaborated than Hooker's theory. And that's the sense in which you can call Locke a kind of proto-liberal individualist to a much greater degree than Hooker. And so what happens when the king, so you have a two-way contract, unlike Hobbes's one-way contract, right? The king has to protect the rights. What if the king fails to protect those rights, right? Fails to protect the rights and liberties of the subjects, then the king violates the contract. And then authority can be returned to the community to remove the king. And of course, that's also what Thomas Jefferson, among others, relied on, right, in the Declaration of Independence. So that's the move. That's the move, right? Turning it into a two-way contract that when the king violates or the monarch violates, all bets are off, and sovereignty is returned to from whence it was delegated, which is the people or the community.
So when we talk about, I don't want to be respectful of your time here, but this question has come up before, and I can't remember who I had on to ask this. If this question doesn't fit, that's totally fine. We can skip it. But can you talk a little bit about the difference between focusing on natural law versus natural rights? Is that one way of looking at the difference between Hooker and Locke?
I do think that that's a relevant thing. So Leo Strauss, and this is another place where I think his history of ideas is a little flawed. I respect him a lot as a thinker and a philosopher, but I think his history of ideas is a little flawed here. There was a theory that in Strauss promoted this particularly, that natural rights is modern and natural law is classical and medieval. And what did he mean by that? Well, natural law speaks in the language of obligation, right? So natural law would tell you, like, you have a duty to respect authority, a duty to respect the property of others, a duty to respect the lives of others and so forth, right? So the accent is on duties, on a binding law, whereas rights become subjective moral claims, like I have the right to do this. And this is so much part of modern language. That's true, right?
Yeah.
Like I have a right to a vacation. Or I have a right to, right. That's what somebody said, like how it's been extended to almost everything. Everybody loves in modernity. Everything is framed in the language. Look at the abortion battle. It's always framed as right to life versus right to my body.
Yes.
We speak so much. And certainly this liberal idea of autonomy and individualism is much more connected. You see how the idea of rights seems to be much more geared toward the individual. However, there has been a lot of studies, and I would recommend if you take a look at the scholarship of people like Annabel Brett at Cambridge and Brian Tierney, that the idea of rights goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. It was just not particularly Thomistic language, but it emerges from the Franciscans. And it was I'd mentioned the school of Salamanca in Spain in the 16th century. They very clearly were referring to rights. Francisco Vittorio was defending the rights of the American Indians or the Native Americans of the New World, saying you don't have the right to just go in and enslave them, right? Because they have what he called dominium, a right over their own person and their possessions. And so he was saying to the Spaniards themselves, even though he was a Spaniard, you can't just go in and enslave the Indians. And this is a very early development in, we could say, the idea of modern human rights, I would say. So it has an earlier development, which is early modern and late medieval, I would say, this idea of rights. And then it undergoes transformations of all kinds in the modern epoch. But I think Strauss is just plainly wrong there as a matter of historical record. I mean, he just didn't read Vittoria and other people who do talk about rights. Hooker, to my knowledge, doesn't refer to the language of rights, natural rights. He's very Thomistic. So he talks about natural law as this binding law. And of course, Locke very much talks about rights. And there you do have, and this is a distinction, Locke and Hooker, you do have that idea of the individual, my right to property, right? He talks about how in the state of nature, we can, by our labor, create what is ours, right? So that, idea of property is very vital for Locke. So there is they're not the same thinker by any means.
No.
Although Hooker very much influenced Locke.
So where does Locke get that idea from? Is that really from him, or is he drawing from Vittorio and maybe not mentioning it because Vittorio is Roman Catholic?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm inclined to think it might be that.
Yeah, he's like, wow, this is really good, but we just won't say where it's from because I don't get in trouble. Yeah.
I don't 100% know. So Suarez,
right,
for example, who was one of the big, he was before Descartes, one of the gigantic metaphysicians, and he was also a political thinker who talked a lot about these ideas, including the idea of the state of nature and other things. The odds that Locke was totally unfamiliar with those figures is, I would say, very low. So the natural rights discourse was in the air. But I would actually have to write another book to trace the lineage of Locke's actual language of natural rights, because off the top of my head, I don't remember references. Right. He has references to Hooker when he talks about consent and these other concepts, but I don't remember. He must have known, because he's dialoguing with Filmer. There's zero chance he didn't know about Suarez and Bellarmine and these,
right?
And these, right? Because he's attacking Filmer's idea. So, and Filmer's attacking those guys. So it's clear that he knew who they were, but there's no way that he would reference them as prominent authorities for his.
Yes.
So.
Well, first off, let me say thank you for writing this book, because I think that's really helpful to have tracing it from Hooker to Locke. We can leave that to someone else. Maybe someone will listen to this episode and be like, oh, I'm going to write the one about Suarez to Locke, But just to end, besides buying and reading your excellent book, and I really do appreciate it. It's a lot of hard work. What would you recommend to someone who has listened to this whole episode? What's something you'd recommend that they think about or do over the next week?
Well, it's a great question. I think just delving into the history of ideas is just fascinating, and I think many people have, if they haven't studied the history of ideas, they have sort of pat answers. I mentioned like the Enlightenment idea that everyone was living under clerical authoritarianism until the Enlightenment came and liberated. There's a much more interesting and complex story. So I think delving into the history of ideas and actually reading primary sources, right? So I probably, if I hadn't, just when you're just fed what Locke was about, he comes across as a very different figure. When you read him and when you read his actual sources, when you read him in context, you know that there were other Whig thinkers like James Tyrrell and Algernon Sidney who were writing along similar lines. It creates a totally different impression and much deeper and richer impression of these thinkers who are canonical. I mean, Locke is really, the Declaration of Independence, the preamble, is a distillation of Locke's two treatises, I would say.
Yeah.
And so that just the richness of the interaction between ideas and history, I think, is something that people who are even educated laymen would benefit from.
Absolutely. Dr. Rosenthal-Pubul, it's been an absolute joy having you on. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure for me as well, PJ, and I hope to see you again, see your podcasts and so forth going forward.